January 17th, 1966, Andalusia, Spain, the coastal village of Palomares, a place so quiet, so desperately poor, that the 20th century barely remembers to visit it. It is mid-morning, the Mediterranean sun is warming the dirt. Local farmers are out in the fields, doing what their ancestors did for hundreds of years, picking tomatoes. Then the sky rips open. A deafening metallic shriek tears through the clouds. It isn't thunder, it is 30,000 gallons of burning aviation fuel falling like a curtain of liquid hell. Chunks of jagged, molten aluminum rain down on the quiet streets, and hidden within that falling debris are four silver cylinders. Four B-28 thermonuclear bombs. Let's put this in perspective. A single B-28 bomb has a yield of 1.45 megatons. That is roughly 100 times more powerful than the weapon that erased Hiroshima from the face of the earth. And it is raining four of them directly onto a tomato patch. You seriously thought the nuclear apocalypse would start with a dramatic speech. You thought it would be a tense standoff in a war room, culminating in the president solemnly pressing a shiny red button. No. The apocalypse almost started because of a banal traffic accident, a fender bender at 30,000 feet. A B-52G strategic bomber collided with a KC-135 refueling tanker midair. 7 crew members died instantly, and 4 literal ends of the world were dropped right onto a sleepy Spanish village. And today, in this episode, we're going to talk about the greatest and most absurd cover-up of the Cold War. We will see how a local fisherman outsmarted the entire multi-billion-dollar Pentagon, how governments used a bizarre beach party to hide radiation from tourists, and why the dirt in a quiet Spanish town will remain deadly for the next 24,000 years. We are going to look at the anatomy of a disaster that proves the real threat to humanity isn't malice, it's incompetence. To understand how 4 hydrogen bombs end up falling on Spain, you have to understand the math of arrogance. Let's rewind. How did those bombs even get there? Welcome to Operation Chrome Dome. Initiated by the Pentagon in 1960, the strategy was simple and entirely psychotic. The United States military decided that to deter the Soviet Union, American nuclear bombers needed to be in the air constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years. The plan was to maintain a continuous, unblinking global presence, ready to cross into Soviet airspace and turn it into glass at a moment's notice. It sounds like a foolproof display of ultimate power, but Chrome Dome was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. It assumed humans could function like machines, but humans are flesh. They get tired. To keep a fleet of B-52s in the air continuously, pilots were flying 24-hour missions. They were sleeping in shifts inside a vibrating, deafening metal tube. They were swallowing amphetamines just to keep their eyes open. And because a B-52 cannot carry enough fuel to fly for 24 hours straight, they had to refuel in midair. Have you ever tried to thread a needle? Now imagine threading a needle while running on a treadmill. Now imagine the needle is a massive flying gas station. The thread is a strategic nuclear bomber, and you are running at 600 kilometers per hour, 9 kilometers above the Earth. Hopped up on military-grade stimulants, mid-air refueling is a surgical operation. The bomber pilot must maneuver a multi-ton aircraft just meters below the tanker, allowing a metal boom to connect with a receptacle on the plane. It requires absolute precision, but precision is the first victim of fatigue. On that January morning over Palomares, someone blinked. The bomber approached too fast. It struck the refueling boom. The boom snapped, ripping open the spine of the B-52. Sparks flew. The tanker, loaded with aviation fuel, erupted into a fireball that could be seen from the ground. This wasn't a random anomaly. It was statistical inevitability. If you force exhausted men to perform high-speed aerial acrobatics with live nuclear weapons every single day for years, a crash isn't a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The system wasn't broken by the crash. The system was the crash, disguised as a reliable security protocol. So, the planes explode, 7 men die. The B-52 breaks apart, releasing its payload. 4 bombs fall toward Palomares. Therefore, The Pentagon receives the one radio code that makes four-star generals break out in a cold sweat: Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow is the United States military code for an accidental event that involves nuclear weapons, warheads, or components, which does not create the risk of nuclear war. A polite way of saying, "We lost the nukes. Please don't let the Soviets find out." On the ground in Spain, the reality is pure surrealism. Three of the bombs hit land. One parachute deploys perfectly, and the bomb lands softly in a dry riverbed, intact. A miracle. But the other two? Their parachutes fail. They hit the Earth at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Now, a thermonuclear weapon doesn't just go off because you drop it. It requires a highly complex, symmetrical detonation to start the nuclear chain reaction. But the bombs do contain conventional explosives. The trigger's designed to compress the plutonium core. When those two bombs hit the ground, the conventional explosives detonate. There is no mushroom cloud. There is no nuclear flash, but there is a massive explosion, and that explosion shatters the radioactive cores. Plutonium-239 is instantly aerosolized, blowing across 226 hectares of farmland. Within hours, the U.S. military descends on Palomares. They set up Camp Wilson. They cordon off the village. Hundreds of American soldiers dressed in heavy, suffocating hazmat suits and respiratory masks begin sweeping the tomato fields with Geiger counters. The clicking of the machines is deafening. But here is the darkest joke of the day. The U.S. military didn't tell the locals what was happening. While American troops are walking around looking like they are exploring an alien planet, the Spanish peasants are literally standing right next to them in their regular clothes. The farmers are still picking their tomatoes. Children are playing in the dirt. The military tries to buy the contaminated crops, attempting to scrape away the topsoil of an entire agricultural zone. They are fighting an invisible monster, but they have a much bigger problem. They found three bombs. Two are shattered, leaking radiation. One is safe. Where is the fourth? It wasn't on the land. Therefore, it had to be in the sea. The Mediterranean, a deep, dark abyss. The U.S. Navy suddenly faces an existential nightmare. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. If the Soviet Union secretly deploys a submarine and recovers an intact American B-28 thermonuclear bomb from international waters, it would be the greatest intelligence coup in human history. The Soviets would reverse engineer the technology. The geopolitical balance would collapse. So, the United States brings in the heavy artillery. They assemble a fleet of ships. They deploy the most advanced sonar technology of 1966. They bring in supercomputers to calculate trajectories, wind speeds, and ocean currents. The admirals in Washington draw highly complex grids on nautical maps. They search for weeks. They find absolutely nothing. The ocean is too vast, the bottom too rugged. But there was a witness, a local Spanish fisherman named Francisco Simo Orts. He was out on his boat when the sky rained fire. He saw a silver cylinder attached to a parachute drift down and splash into the water. He noted the exact coordinates using nothing but his eyes and his intimate knowledge of the local currents. He goes to the Americans and says, "It's over there." The American admirals, surrounded by their million-dollar radar screens and trajectory algorithms, look at this peasant fisherman and dismiss him. They trust their math. They do not trust a guy who catches sardines for a living, but the math fails. Week after week, the Navy finds nothing. The pressure from Washington becomes unbearable. Every passing day is a political disaster. Therefore, utterly humiliated, the admirals finally swallow their pride. They call Francisco back. "Show us," they say. Francisco points to a spot on the water. The Navy sends down a brand new, highly experimental, deep-diving submersible called Alvin. It looks like a tiny, cramped metal sphere. Two men squeeze inside and dive into the crushing blackness of the Mediterranean. For days, they scour the underwater mountains, and then, at a depth of 800 meters, the headlights of the Alvin catch a reflection, a massive silver cylinder resting on a steep underwater ridge, tangled in its own parachute. Francisco, the fisherman with no formal education, was perfectly right. The algorithms were perfectly wrong. The locals later nicknamed him underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, Paco of the bomb. But finding the bomb is not recovering the bomb. The Navy attempts to pull it up. They attach a heavy cable to the parachute rigging. The winches on the surface ship begin to grind, slowly lifting the multi-ton nuclear weapon from the seafloor. They pull it up hundreds of meters. They are almost there. Snap. The cable breaks. The bomb drops back into the abyss. And because it was resting on a slope, it rolls. It falls even deeper, vanishing into a dark underwater canyon. It is a complete operational fiasco. The military has literally dropped a nuclear bomb twice, once from the sky and once in the ocean. It takes another agonizing month to find it again. Finally, in April 1966, almost 80 days after it fell from the sky, the fourth bomb is hauled onto the deck of the USS Petrel. It is dented, scratched, but intact. The Navy breathes a sigh of relief. The world is safe. But is it? The bomb in the ocean was recovered. But what about the village? Palomares was still coated in weapon-grade plutonium. Plutonium-239 is one of the most toxic substances known to science. Inhaling a particle the size of a speck of dust practically guarantees lung cancer, and its half-life is 24,000 years. You cannot wash away plutonium. You can only move it. The United States Army Corps of Engineers engages in a massive, panicked landscaping project. They scrape up thousands of tons of radioactive topsoil. They pack it into 4,800 steel barrels. They load those barrels onto ships, transport them across the Atlantic, and bury them in a nuclear waste graveyard in Aiken, South Carolina. But they can't take all the dirt. They just take the dirt that clicks the loudest on the Geiger counters. Meanwhile, a massive political crisis is brewing. Spain is ruled by the dictator Francisco Franco. His regime relies heavily on one major economic engine: foreign tourism. Northern Europeans flock to the Spanish coast for the sun and the pristine beaches. If the world finds out that the coastal waters and local tomatoes are glowing with American plutonium, the tourism industry will instantly collapse. Therefore, the governments realize they need to fix not the radiation, but the perception of radiation. They need a PR stunt. A spectacle so absurd it overrides the public's basic survival instincts. Enter Manuel Fraga, the Spanish Minister of Information and Tourism, and Angel Biddleduke, the U.S. ambassador to Spain. On March 8, 1966, they arrive at the beach near Palomares. They have invited dozens of journalists and photographers. The air is tense. The world is watching. What do? They strip down to their bathing suits. With cameras flashing, the two men confidently wade into the freezing Mediterranean water. They splash around, they smile broadly, they wave at the press. Look, they are essentially saying, the water is fine, we are swimming. Come to Spain, bring your children, buy our tomatoes. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The visual of two powerful men happily swimming in the ocean completely short-circuits the public's fear of invisible radiation. The newspapers run the photos. The public is instantly pacified. The tourism season is saved. It is a classic substitution of reality. The viewer sees a happy beach holiday. But just a few miles inland, hidden behind military checkpoints, men in hazmat suits are still shoveling highly toxic dirt into steel drums. The Geiger counter clicks, but the camera smiles. The system prioritizes its own reputation over the biological reality of its citizens. And this isn't just a story from the past. The echo of that PR stunt still rings today, because plutonium doesn't care about press conferences. It doesn't care about smiling ambassadors. Almost 60 years have passed since the sky rained bombs over Palomares, and Palomares is still radioactive. The U.S. military's 1966 cleanup was a rush job. They took the surface dirt, but the wind had already blown the plutonium dust into deep trenches and surrounding hills. It seeped into the ground. For decades, the residents of Palomares have lived in a state of suspended anxiety. They are a village of human guinea pigs. They regularly undergo medical testing, giving blood and urine samples to government scientists, tracking the long-term effects of low-dose radiation exposure. The land is stunted. Construction in certain areas is strictly banned because digging into the earth means digging up the Cold War. In 2015, the United States and Spain had to sign yet another diplomatic agreement to execute a final, definitive cleanup of the area. Half a century later, they are still trying to put the genie back in the bottle. The incident at Palomares is not a glitch in the Matrix, it is the Matrix itself. We look at nuclear weapons, and we see the ultimate triumph of human engineering. We see physics mastered. We see godlike power. But that power is tethered to the most flawed, fragile system on Earth. Us. We created weapons capable of splitting a planet in half, but we trust their delivery to exhausted 22-year-old pilots running on caffeine and speed. We trust their recovery to arrogant bureaucrats who ignore local fishermen because they believe a computer screen is smarter than human experience. We trust the safety of our environment to politicians who think swimming in a swimsuit is an adequate substitute for environmental decontamination. The broken arrow of Palomares shows us the terrifying truth of the modern world. We are just apes holding nuclear grenades. We build systems that are far too complex for our own biology to manage. And the only reason we are still here, the only reason you are sitting there watching this video, is not because of fail-safes. It is not because of brilliant planning. It is simply because, so far, we have been incredibly, historically, inexplicably lucky. But luck, unlike plutonium, doesn't last for 24,000 years.